Cale Othman, Jorik Steele, and Riven Halloway thought their secret was buried forever. They had planned everything, covered their tracks, and silenced the only witness, Zaylen Cordova. But what they didn't realize was that their biggest mistake wasn't the murder itself. It was the group chat. Hidden within their own messages were the chilling confessions, the gruesome images, and the undeniable proof of what they had done. And when the wrong person stumbled upon their twisted conversations, the truth they had tried so hard to bury came crashing to the surface, exposing a crime more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Zaylen Cordova had always been the type of person who could light up a room without even trying. At 17, he had a carefree energy that made people naturally gravitate toward him. He loved skateboarding through the quiet streets of his small town, often blasting music through his headphones as he performed tricks near the local convenience store. His teachers described him as bright but easily distracted, and his friends knew him as someone who would drop everything to help if they needed him. He wasn't the type to get into trouble, and he definitely wasn't the type to disappear without a trace, but that's exactly what happened. It was an ordinary Friday evening when Zaylen left home. He told his mother he was meeting up with friends and would be back later. There was nothing unusual about his behavior. No signs of distress. No indication that anything was wrong. He grabbed his phone, his skateboard, and his favorite hoodie before stepping out the door. That was the last time anyone in his family saw him. When he didn't return home that night, his mother, Fiona Cordova, wasn't immediately alarmed. She assumed he had stayed over at a friend's house, something he had done before. But as morning came and there was still no sign of him, worry began to set in. She called his phone multiple times, but each call went straight to voicemail. She reached out to his friends asking if he was with them, but they all gave the same answer. They hadn't seen him. By the afternoon, Fiona was frantic. She drove around town, stopping at all the places Zaylen usually hung out. She checked the skate park, the gas station where he and his friends often bought snacks, and even the wooded trails where he sometimes went to clear his head. There was no sign of him anywhere. When evening came, she went to the police station to report him missing. At first, the officers weren't overly concerned. Teenagers went missing all the time, and most of the time, they showed up within a day or two. They asked if he had been having trouble at home, if he had fought with anyone, if there was any reason he might have wanted to run away. Fiona insisted that he wouldn't just disappear. He had no reason to leave. Over the next few days, Zaylen's disappearance became the talk of the town. Flyers with his face were taped to streetlights and pinned to bulletin boards. His family pleaded with the public for any information, and the local news station covered the story, urging people to come forward if they had seen him. The search efforts grew, with volunteers combing through nearby fields, abandoned buildings, and wooded areas. But no matter how hard they looked, there were no clues. The lack of evidence was unsettling. There were no reported sightings, no security footage of him leaving town, and his phone remained off. Police checked his social media accounts, but nothing pointed to where he might have gone. His last post had been a simple picture of his skateboard with the caption, "Late Night Ride." It was posted just hours before he vanished. As days turned into weeks, theories began to emerge. Some believed he had run away, though his family refused to accept that idea. Others whispered about more sinister possibilities. The town had seen crime before, but a teenager disappearing without a single trace. That was something different. Then, just as it seemed like the case was growing cold, something unexpected happened. A student at Zaylen's high school came forward with something unusual, an invitation to a private group chat filled with disturbing messages. What seemed like a simple curiosity at first would soon unravel a horrifying truth that no one in the town was prepared for. Dren Whitmore wasn't particularly close to Zaylen Cordova, but in a small town like theirs, everyone knew each other. When the news of Zaylen's disappearance spread, he, like everyone else, had followed the story with curiosity and concern. He had seen the missing posters around school, listened to the hushed conversations in the hallways, and watched as Zaylen's friends struggled to make sense of his sudden vanishing. But none of it had personally affected Dren, until he received an unexpected invitation to a private group chat. At first, he thought it was just another random chat someone had added him to. It wasn't unusual for students to create group messages filled with inside jokes and gossip. But this one felt different. The chat was named The Reckoning, which immediately caught his attention. The members were a mix of students he recognized, though he wasn't particularly friendly with them. Among them were Cale Othman, Jorik Steele, and Riven Halloway, 3 guys with reputations for being troublemakers. They weren't the kind of people Dren associated with, and it was strange that they had included him in their chat. As he scrolled through the messages, a sense of unease settled over him. The conversation was filled with cryptic comments, inside references, and unsettling remarks that seemed to hint at something dark. At first it was vague, comments about getting away with it, and how some secrets are meant to stay buried. Dren didn't understand what they were talking about, but something about the way they worded things made him feel uncomfortable. Then he saw a message that made his stomach drop. "Do you think they'll ever find him?" Dren's hands tightened around his phone. He reread the message, hoping he had misunderstood. The response that followed was even worse. "Not unless they dig in the right place." His pulse quickened. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but everything about the chat felt wrong. The conversation continued with jokes that seemed too cruel to be random. Someone mentioned cleaning up loose ends, and another person responded with laughing emojis. There was no direct mention of Zaylen, but it didn't need to be spelled out for Dren to understand that they were referring to something serious, something that sounded eerily connected to the missing teen. He debated whether he should leave the chat or ask what they were talking about, but his gut told him to keep quiet. Instead, he scrolled further, his eyes scanning for any more clues. That was when he saw the photo. It was blurry, taken in low lighting, but what it showed was unmistakable. A bloodied shoe, partially buried in dirt, with dried leaves scattered around it. The shoe itself wasn't entirely visible, but the style and color looked familiar. Dren had seen Zaylen wear something just like it. His breath caught in his throat. He wanted to believe it was a prank, that these guys were just messing around. But something in his gut told him this was real. The messages, the way they spoke so casually, the shoe, it all pointed to something terrible. His fingers shook as he took screenshots of everything, carefully saving each image and message. His first instinct was to go to his friends, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. If this was real, if these guys were involved in something horrific, he needed to go to the police. He hesitated, second-guessing himself. What if he was wrong? What if it really was just a twisted joke? But deep down, he knew he couldn't ignore it. That night, he didn't sleep. The images and words replayed in his mind over and over. When the sun finally rose, he made his decision. He walked straight to the police station and handed them his phone. He had no idea what he had just uncovered, but he knew one thing for sure. The truth was about to come out. The police wasted no time once they saw the messages and images on Dren Whitmore's phone. The evidence was too alarming to ignore. Investigators immediately traced the group chat's participants, focusing on Cale Othman, Jorik Steele, and Riven Halloway. Within hours, officers arrived at their homes, confiscating their phones and bringing them in for questioning. At first, the 3 teenagers acted unconcerned. They shrugged off the messages, calling them inside jokes that had been misinterpreted. They claimed the shoe in the photo wasn't Zaylen's, and that the entire chat was nothing more than harmless banter. Their parents, shocked by the accusations, insisted their sons had nothing to do with the missing boy. But the digital trail told a different story. Forensic experts examined their phones and discovered that several files had been recently deleted. When investigators recovered the data, they found something horrifying. Photos and videos that left no doubt about what had happened to Zaylen. The first image was clearer than the one in the group chat. It showed a shoe identical to the one Zaylen had been wearing the night he disappeared, half buried in dirt, with blood dried along the edge of the sole. The background revealed part of a wooded area just outside town. Then came the videos. The first clip was short, shaky, and recorded in the dark. Zalen could be seen walking ahead of the camera, his skateboard tucked under his arm. He seemed unaware that he was being filmed. A second clip showed him inside what appeared to be an abandoned shed, standing in the dim glow of a flashlight. His expression was relaxed, his posture casual. He had no idea he was in danger. The next recording was different. It was longer, the audio distorted by wind and muffled voices. The screen was chaotic, but it was clear enough to see what was happening. Zalen was on the ground, his body twisted, his arms shielding his head as someone stood over him. The attacker was partially visible, just a dark figure looming above. A sickening crunch sounded before the screen cut to black. The final clip was the worst. The camera was steady this time, positioned low to the ground, as if placed deliberately to capture what came next. Zalen lay still, motionless, his face obscured by the angle. Dirt and leaves clung to his clothes. Voices whispered off camera, discussing what to do next. Then a hand reached into the frame, gripping a shovel. The recording ended just as the first pile of dirt was thrown over his body. Investigators felt sick watching the footage. There was no doubt now, Zalen had been murdered, and the people responsible had treated it like a game, recording every moment as if it were entertainment. The three teenagers were confronted with the evidence, but their reactions were unsettling. Kale remained stone-faced, showing no emotion. Jorik smirked slightly, as if amused by the situation. Riven, the quietest of the group, simply stared at the table in front of him. Not one of them showed remorse. As officers pressed them for details, cracks started to form in their silence. Kale refused to speak, but Jorik, either out of arrogance or a desire to shift blame, began to talk. He claimed that they hadn't meant for things to go as far as they did, that it was all supposed to be a prank, until it wasn't. Riven, looking increasingly uncomfortable, nodded along but still refused to speak. It wasn't long before the police had enough information to locate the burial site. A team of officers and forensic specialists followed the clues from the recovered footage, searching the woods just outside of town. It didn't take long for them to find a shallow grave, hastily covered with dirt and leaves. Zalen Cordova's body was finally found. As the town learned the devastating truth, the case was no longer just about a missing teenager. It had become something far worse. A murder planned, carried out, and documented by those who had once called themselves his friends. The discovery of Zalen Cordova's body sent shockwaves through the town. What had started as a missing person case had turned into a brutal murder investigation, and the evidence was undeniable. News spread quickly, and the community was left reeling. Parents looked at their own children with unease, wondering how a group of teenagers could commit such a horrific act. The police worked swiftly to build their case. With the digital evidence, the group chat, and the recovered body, there was no doubt that Cale Othman, Jorik Steele, and Riven Halloway were responsible. However, the question remained: why? What had led these teenagers to kill Zalen? The interrogations continued, and the truth began to emerge. Jorik, emboldened by the attention, was the first to break. He described it as a game that had spiraled out of control. They had lured Zalen to the abandoned shed under the guise of hanging out, knowing all along that they planned to mess with him. According to Jorik, it was supposed to be harmless, scare him, rough him up a little, and record it for laughs. But somewhere along the way, things escalated. Kyle, the one who had remained the most silent, was described as the ringleader. He had a fascination with power, control, and violence. He was the one who had suggested the idea, pushing it further, each time. What started as a joke turned into an attack, and once Zalen was on the ground, injured and vulnerable, Cale decided they couldn't let him leave. They had crossed a line, and he knew Zalen wouldn't stay quiet about it. Jorik claimed he never intended for Zalen to die, but when Cale took things further, he didn't stop him. Neither did Riven. They stood by, and watched as their friend's life was taken from him. When it was over, Cale ordered them to help bury the body. The videos weren't just for amusement, they were trophies, proof of what they had done. Riven, the quietest of the group, finally spoke during his interrogation. His hands trembled as he recounted the night. He insisted that he hadn't wanted to be part of it, that he had felt sick watching it happen, but he had done nothing to stop it, and when it was time to cover up the crime, he had helped. His silence made him just as guilty. With confessions secured, the police pieced together the full timeline. On the night Zaylen disappeared, he had unknowingly walked into a trap. He had trusted the wrong people, believing they were just there to hang out. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was too late. They had overpowered him, beaten him, and ultimately ended his life. The town struggled to comprehend the cruelty of it all. The idea that 3 teenagers, barely old enough to drive, could commit such a senseless act of violence was beyond disturbing. The community grieved not only for Zaylen, but for the innocence they had lost. Parents questioned how they had missed the warning signs, how they had failed to see what these boys were capable of. The case moved quickly to prosecution. Prosecutors, determined to seek justice for Zaylen, pushed for the harshest charges possible. Despite their young age, all 3 were charged as adults with first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no doubt that they would spend years, if not their entire lives, behind bars. As the trial loomed, one final chilling detail emerged. The group chat had not been created after the crime. It had existed before. The messages dated back weeks, showing that this was never a moment of rage or an accident. They had planned it. They had talked about it, joked about it, and treated it like some twisted thrill. Zaylen never stood a chance. The trial of Cale Othman, Jorik Steele, and Riven Holloway became the most talked-about case the town had ever seen. Reporters crowded the courthouse, families filled the gallery, and the weight of Zaylen Cordova's death hung over the proceedings, like a storm cloud. Every detail of the crime was dissected in court, from the disturbing group chat messages to the gruesome video evidence that left the jury visibly shaken. The prosecution painted the 3 teens as cold-blooded killers who had plotted and carried out a brutal murder with no remorse. They showed screenshots of the messages where the boys had joked about getting away with it, proving that Zaylen's death had been premeditated. The recovered footage of Zaylen's final moments was played for the jury, leaving no doubt about what had happened that night. It was impossible to argue that this was an accident or a prank gone wrong. The intent was clear. Cale Othman, the ringleader, sat emotionless as the evidence was presented. His lack of reaction only solidified the perception that he was the mastermind behind it all. Jorik Steele, who had initially been cocky during his arrest, looked noticeably uncomfortable in the courtroom, realizing that his arrogant bravado wouldn't save him now. Riven Holloway, the quietest of the 3, barely lifted his head, as if the weight of his guilt was finally sinking in. The defense attorneys tried to argue that the boys were too young to fully grasp the consequences of their actions, but the jury didn't buy it. The methodical way they had lured Zaylen to the abandoned shed, the way they had recorded the attack, and the way they had buried his body with such casual disregard proved otherwise. These weren't impulsive kids making a mistake. These were individuals who had made a calculated decision to end a life. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. Cale Othman was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life, in prison without the possibility of parole. His expression remained unchanged, as if he had already accepted his fate. Jorik Steele and Riven Holloway, though not the ones who had delivered the fatal blows, were found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to decades behind bars. Jorik's bravado shattered the moment he heard his sentence, his face going pale as the reality of spending his life in prison sank in. Riven simply wept, though no one could tell if it was for Zaylen or for himself. Zaylen Cordova's family sobbed quietly, holding each other as justice was finally served. It didn't bring him back, but at least those responsible would never have the chance to hurt anyone else. In the aftermath of the trial, the town was left with an unshakable sense of loss. Parents no longer looked at their children the same way. Teachers watched their students more closely, wondering if there were other warning signs they had missed. The case became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of how quickly friendships could turn deadly and how social media could expose even the darkest secrets. The group chat that had been created as a place to brag about a murder had ultimately led to the killer's downfall. What they had thought was their private space to mock the crime had become the very evidence that sealed their fate. They had exposed themselves without even realizing it. As time passed, the town tried to move on, but Zaylen's absence was felt everywhere. His skateboard, once a familiar sight rolling down the streets, was now just a painful memory. The places he used to hang out with his friends felt emptier. His name was etched into murals and memorials, a reminder of the bright future stolen from him by those he had trusted. And in the quiet corners of the internet, the story of his murder lived on, an unsettling testament to how a single group chat had revealed the true nature of 3 teenage killers.